Permitting and inspections is terribly confusing. A lot of people get all mixed up with this. Now, I've been pulling permits for over a decade in 31 different municipalities across 6 different states. And in this video, I'm going to show you what permitting actually is. I'm going to show you who pulls what permits, the inspection flow chart, and what I call the hierarchy of power, which means who has authority over different things. And it's really important that you understand each one of these things. Let's start with just making sure we have some like first principles, some common terminology here, because a lot of people intermix different words and it gets really confusing. Okay, first off, there are codes enforcement inspectors. These are the people that work in the city or the building department of the city. And there are also home inspectors. Okay, these are different people. A home inspector is when you go to buy a house, you hire a home inspection company. It's a third-party company. They're looking for a bunch of crap that is improperly functioning on your house. That's not a building inspector. Okay, building inspector, codes enforcement inspector, an inspector for the city. All the same crap. Okay, now there are different departments within different cities, and just city, a municipality, these are also intermixing terms. And I'm saying all of these because I want you to understand that when you're talking to different people, they're going to use different terms. A lot of them mean the same thing, so don't get yourself confused. But their job, okay, is to enforce the code. So there is a code that is adopted really across the country, but each state, as we're going to get into here in a little bit with the hierarchy of power, adopts a different version of that code. Okay, but the people who work in the building department at your municipality, their job is to go into your house that you're working on and make sure that you have applied the codes in that adopted code book correctly. That is their job. Okay, it's much different than, for say, a home inspector. There are certain things that these guys are not looking at, and you need to understand that. And we're going to get into all of that here in this video and future videos in this series. Now, before you pull a permit, okay, so you got to pull a permit. If you're going to do work on a house, you have to pull a permit, or you're supposed to pull a permit. We'll get into all that later. I'm not a Boy Scout here, but technically speaking, you're supposed to pull a permit to do this work. Now, depending on where you live, the permitting process might be really easy. You go up, you pull a permit, it's in your hand. Some places don't even require permits for certain things. And you pull this permit, and if it's a big renovation on a house, or let's say an addition, or if you're building something new or developing land, usually there's a review process before the actual permit can be given to you. So this review process is inside of the building department. There's like a reviews board. Some places it takes a really long time. So when I used to be in Colorado, I mean, even pulling a simple permit on a house, I would go up there and I would have to sit for hours. Like I would basically give the whole day to just sitting and waiting in line to be able to be the first in line. And then you would go up there with your plans. Usually you'd have to have some sort of site plan and what you're going to do. You may even have to hire an architect to get these plans made. And then you would go up there, you would give them the plans, and they would have to either take it through review, or they would say, oh, you know what, we can't even take that into review because you messed up X, Y, and Z. Then you'd go back, fix X, Y, and Z, give another day to go back up there and sit and wait to be next in line just to tell you you were wrong. That was a terrible process. In Tennessee, for instance, Chattanooga is where I am, you can get permits over the counter, meaning I go up there, basically draw on the back of a napkin the site plan if they ask for it, and I have permits that day, walk into the job site, and I'm ready to work. Funny enough, just so you understand how different municipalities could be, there's Denver, which that was the all-day event, but right next to that is Wheat Ridge, and I would walk into Wheat Ridge and be able to get permits over the counter just like I'm able to do here in Chattanooga. So very dependent on where you're at. So once you've gone through this reviews process, obviously it's a bigger reviews process for bigger developments and such. Mostly I'm talking about getting a renovation remodeling permit to be able to flip a house. And some take longer, some are shorter. But once you have these permits in hand, now you have different inspection points throughout the process where this codes enforcement or building inspector needs to come in. But there are different types of inspectors. Okay, the different types of inspectors, it's like this. I have a building permit, and a general contractor is generally going to pull these building permits. But there's also mechanical, which is HVAC, that's your heating and cooling, or the duct work for, let's say, a dryer vent, the duct work for different venting of different utilities inside your house. So that's HVAC. Mechanical is synonymous. Plumbing, electrical, these are other permits. Now your GC cannot pull the permits for mechanical, electrical, plumbing. So the GC goes and gets the building permit. Could be a GC, by the way, could be homeowner. There are other ways that you personally can pull this building permit, by the way, which we're going to get to much later in a different video. GC pulls the building permit, and then underneath that, you would have the mechanical permit, you'd have the electrical permit, you'd have a plumbing permit. Some places are going to require a gas permit. Some places may have a roofing permit that needs to be pulled separately. Some places are going to have a demo permit that needs to be pulled separately. If you're doing a big development, you would have to pull a land disturbance permit because the city wants to make sure that if you're messing with all the earth here, that you don't have water that's shedding off into the city or into your neighbors' yards or whatever. So that's going to be a separate permit altogether. That's getting into more development stuff. A lot of times on renovations, you're not going to have to worry about the land disturbance stuff. Okay, but you see that you have general permit, and then underneath that, these other ones get pulled. Okay, and they get pulled by licensed professionals inside of that. Okay, now, before we get to the hierarchy of power, I want to go through the inspection flow. And this could get more complex. This is going to be different in every municipality. Okay, but I want to give you the broad picture of this, the most general picture of this, just so you can get your mind flowing. My goal with this video is to make sure that you see all the pieces that you have to play with as an investor, as somebody who's managing one of these projects. And I need you to know what to go look for in your specific municipality is the point here. Okay, so here's how a project goes. Generally, you're going to have demo, right? That'll be the first thing you do. Some places you're going to need a permit. After that, you're going to do framing. All right, now this is where it gets confusing. Framing does need inspected. However, you can't get framing inspected and passed until you do some other things first. Because after framing is done, now you can do your mechanical or HVAC, right? You can do your electrical. I have terrible handwriting, don't worry. You can do your plumbing. You can do, if gas is a separate permit, okay, you can do all that gas work. Okay, now you go and get your inspections for each one of these after you do that work. Okay, so you got an inspection point here, inspection point here, inspection point here. You may have an inspection point there, by the way. Okay, so after you've done each one of those, you get inspected and you get your rough inspection. So each one of these are going to have a rough and they'll have a final, which we're going to get to. All right, you have, after you've passed each one of these, now you'd think that you can go get your framing. Now, just to be clear, why they do the framing after this is because a plumber might come in and cut through all the floor joists to run their 3-inch sewer line. And since they cut through all those floor joists, now they've weakened them to where, well, they don't meet code standards anymore. That's why the framing inspection comes after the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and depending on your municipality, gas. However, that is not it. you're still not ready to get the building inspection, because in most municipalities, you need to get insulation inspected. A lot of energy code goes around this, but you'd think that, oh gosh, insulation is pretty easy, right? Nope. A lot of people mess that one up. Okay, so I just realized I'm not showing that. We have insulation after that. And so you got to get the insulation inspected. And here's one quick thing about the insulation is there's 3 different spots that insulation goes. Insulation could go in the floorboards underneath the house. It could go in the walls, and it would go in the ceiling above the drywall, right? And if you have 2 stories, you could put insulation in between the 2 stories. You don't need to. There's no code that says. A lot of people do it for sound deadening, but that generally is not going to get inspected. The stuff in between the stories. Above the top level in the attic will be. All right, but the stuff in the floor and in the ceiling will be accessible throughout the whole entire project, even when you're completely done. You can always stick your head up in the attic, look at the insulation, and you can see underneath in a crawl space or in a basement the insulation underneath. Of course, if you're going to be covering it up, you would need to get that inspected at the rough end time, because we're still here in this is all rough building is what they would call it. Okay. So the walls certainly need inspected and passed beforehand, but in a lot of cases, the attic insulation you would do later on in the project at the final building inspection, because most of the time people are going to blow it in. They use the loose pink stuff, blow-in insulation. So if you're using that stuff, you need the drywall on first, but obviously we haven't put drywall on yet because, we haven't passed all the inspections yet. Now, I am through insulation. Now I need to think about the next spot, which is actually my rough building or framing inspection. So that's something that you need to understand, that these words are interchangeable. Rough building inspection or framing inspection. Some places call them different things. Also understand that sometimes an insulation inspection is part of the rough building inspection. Some municipalities have a separate inspection for the insulation. Some just go straight to rough building and they look at all of those things. I know it gets confusing. Once again, I'm trying to put you on the right scent, not necessarily tell you exactly how it is for every municipality. That would be a terrible job. Okay, so I have the insulation, and then I have framing. Now, for most people, this is the end of the rough inspections. You get through framing, and now there's clear skies ahead. And also, by the way, this is exactly why I call all of those inspections, the rough building inspections, all the way through rough building. It's why I call it the gauntlet. If you have looked at my strategy videos and the different phases and such, I call it the gauntlet for obvious reasons. You're going in and out of these inspections, and guys, I'm just telling you right now that a lot of people freak out and they want to get everything right because they might fail an inspection. Who freaking cares? I fail inspections all the time, and in fact, we're going to get to it later. I think if you're passing all the inspections all the time, you're probably over renovating the crap out of things. And so don't worry about it. If you fail an inspection, you fail an inspection. I'll tell you that I used to, first permits I ever pulled back in the day, over a decade ago, I remember that I would go with a level and look at every stud, to make sure it was level, because I was freaked out the inspector was going to come and think I was a fool. And they didn't even look at that stuff. They don't care. I mean, I spent weeks making sure everything was plumb, everything was perfect, everything. They don't care at all. I mean, I guess if it was so terrible, but I'm telling you, after doing this for 15 years, the crappy work that people do that still gets passed would shock you. Okay. So you don't got to freak out here. Now, for most people, that is the end of the rough building. And now it's blue skies ahead. However, there are some municipalities that first want you to get drywall inspected. Okay. And then you're blue skies ahead. And it's not even the drywall finishing, it's the drywall hanging. Because technically speaking, drywall is part of what the code book would call the building envelope, which means it helps with the structure. If you think about it, it helps with like shear strength. So really what they're looking for is it's called a drywall screw test. This is a sloppy sheet of drywall, but you can imagine there's studs behind there, and there's certain rules on how the screws need to be spaced. Okay, these are screws. They're looking for the screws. They're making sure that the paper didn't get popped through. You know, you need to sink the screw, but you don't want to break the paper, because once you break the paper, you've broken the strength of it. Okay, but if you have a drywall, this isn't a drywall video. This is and that's too many screws, by the way. It's 6 on the perimeter studs, and it's 5 in the center ones. I think that's right. I don't have drywall inspections out here, but you want to make sure things are done right anyway. After drywall in those municipalities, you're ready to rock and roll. Okay. So now at that point, you would go and do all of the finishes, all the installs. You would do your trim, your cabinets, vanities. Obviously these are renovations. You're not doing all of them probably in every project. Some you might. You would hang your light fixtures. You would put in your plumbing fixtures, your toilets. You would put the vents in for HVAC. You would have everything done. And at this point, you have another round of inspections. Okay, so now, same kind of thing here. You have mechanical, electrical, plumbing, gas if you have it, and you have a final inspection for each one of these. The red means inspection, or some municipalities or some people would call them trim inspections. They're looking at the trim, and then we go and there is the final building inspection. So you have to have all of those done. Now you can do final building. Okay, and this is where they're going to come. They're going to look at a lot of different things. They're going to look to make sure you have smoke alarms. They're going to make sure that all the safety and liability stuff is done. They're going to make sure you have the insulation in the attic now, insulation in the floorboards if your municipality requires that. They're going to make sure that it's completely done. And then depending on where you're at, sometimes just passing a final building gets you the certificate of occupancy. The final building inspection itself is the certificate of occupancy. Sometimes you have to call in another certificate of occupancy inspection. So, and once you have that, then you're officially, the permitting is done. Now, here's the thing. I've talked a lot about different municipalities and such, and this is where the hierarchy of power comes in, as I'm calling it. And this is where things get super confusing. Okay, because you have, let's just look at this I guess we could look at it like a pyramid. You would have your codes, right? You got the International Residential Code is the one that we follow every place I've ever been. That's what it follows. There's a different international code if you're doing commercial stuff. It's the IBC, I think. I forget what that stands for, but we're talking about residential anyway. So commercial gets a little bit more complex. You got the International Residential Code. They're always redoing this. There's whatever, some random situation happened, and now they need to update the code to fit that in. And these are happening all the time. So there's the code across everything. And it is reasonable for you to expect any contractor to adopt code. They should be doing things correctly to code all the time. That is reasonable to expect. That is the default state. Okay, doesn't happen all the time. Doesn't happen most of the time, actually. Okay, but it is reasonable to say that is what workmanlike behavior is to do those things. Now, that's not it though, because then you have, in the state that you're in, they probably have not adopted the newest version of the code. It might not be the 2026 International Residential Code. They might be going by the 2018 International Residential Code. And when a general contractor like myself goes to test to get my license, I go take the test over the 2018 code, not the 2026 code. And in fact, when I tested, I think it was the 2018 code. So I went in there, open book test, by the way, because they don't expect anybody to know all the things by heart. They expect them to know what and when to look things up and where to find it. So you go in there with the code book and a bunch of other books, and I am taking the test over the 2018, not the 2026. Maybe it's been updated since I had to test. But the point is that there's international code, but then what supersedes that is the state code. And the state might have different ordinances that they've put on top of the code in addition to the code. Okay, but generally, those things aren't done at the state level. Those are done at the city or municipality or county level, depending on who you're pulling permits for. So you go down to the city or to your municipality or to your county and you pull the permit for the actual job. Each one of these places has their own ordinances that are in addition to the code. Okay, they also may have adopted a different yet higher version of the International Residential Code. There have been places where I had to retest just for the municipality that I'm in, or do an additional test for the municipality that I'm in. I know, right? So not only do you have to keep track of the code that your state has adopted, but you also need to constantly look up if any ordinance changes have happened within your city, because those supersede the state adopted code. But on top of that, there is manufacturer specs. Manufacturer specs. So a lot of times, and even in the code book, it suggests this, that if there are rules from the manufacturer of a certain material or supply, that supersedes all of this. They just turn to that because, guys, truly, this is all a big game of hot potato, of liability. I don't want the liability of something bad happening to be on the city, so I can put it on the manufacturer here. I think that's really what it comes down to, which leads me to the final one, which is an engineer. Okay. If something is not well defined within the code itself, or you have a dispute, what you can do is you can hire an engineer to write you up a plan that is outside of those things. Now, obviously, an engineer is not going to write up something that isn't safe. Okay. They're probably going to overdo the crap out of it. But if you have this engineer's plan, in most cases, every case that I've ever run into, almost, the city basically has to accept the engineer's stamped plan. Okay, so this happens a lot of times if you're like removing a wall for opening up a kitchen or whatever. You go get an engineer's letter, and if you had permits pulled, you would show them. There are situations where I've had houses that are like caving in, and the city, if you're going to do everything to code, you'd basically have to tear the damn house down. Okay, but an engineer can come in there and write a specific plan for that. Obviously, you're going to have to pay for that. In later videos, we're going to get deep into that and grandfathering and open cans of worms. But I just wanted you to understand the hierarchy of power, the chain of command, so to speak, that each one of these levels supersedes the next. In most cases, there is some gray area here. I have been in situations where the city has asked me to do things against an engineer's plan. It wasn't necessarily a situation where an engineer wrote a specific letter for like removing a wall and the city said, no, I know better. It was more like an engineered set of plans. The city asked one detail different. So a smaller thing there, but gray area in all of this. And I'm telling you right now, you get an inspection done by one inspector, the next inspector that comes might tell you something different. And it is a frustrating game at times. And also the same inspector one day might say something different than the same inspector that comes the next day. I mean, just think about it. These guys are seeing all kinds of projects every day. So I guess it is reasonable to think. And that's why it is so important for you to understand these rules. Now, I got one more thing for you, but guys, I have a free school community. It's in the description below, and we talk about this kind of stuff all the time. So if you feel overwhelmed by any of this, this is what I do all day. Check it out there. But all of this confusion, you have to get worked out because you're going to deal with this stuff. However, this is why some investors out there, they think instead of pulling permits, maybe I think about evading the permits a little bit. And that's why I made the next video in this series, which is how to evade permits legally. Maybe. Anyway, check it out. I'll see you guys soon.